Welcome back to Whispers of Time. I'm your guide through the forgotten corridors of human history. Tonight, we're entering a world most humans today have never truly known, a world without light. Before you settle in, I want you to imagine something. Close your eyes if you'd like. Picture yourself standing outside as darkness falls. Not the darkness you know. Not the kind where streetlights flicker on, or the glow of distant cities softens the night sky. Not the darkness of a bedroom, where your phone can be reached with a single gesture. I mean something far more complete than that. I mean real darkness, total darkness. The kind where your hand held directly in front of your face becomes invisible. The kind where sound becomes your only reliable sense, and your own heartbeat seems louder than the entire world around you. The kind where fear is not abstract but physical, a weight in your chest, a quickening pulse, a constant awareness of your own fragility. Here's something most people don't realize. For the vast majority of human existence, for roughly 400,000 years, this was normal. This was simply what night meant. And it wasn't a brief inconvenience. Depending on where humans lived and what season it was, this darkness lasted anywhere from 10 to 14 hours every single night. That's not a few minutes of adjustment time. That's an extended ordeal that had to be endured night after night after night for an entire human lifetime. Tonight, we're exploring the lives of humanity's night watchers. The men, women, and children who lived in a world where darkness was not merely the absence of light, but an active, overwhelming presence. A presence that shaped not just how they survived, but who they became as a species. A presence that quite possibly gave birth to human imagination, spirituality, and art itself. But here's what makes this story truly gripping. We're not talking about a peaceful transition into sleep. We're talking about a nightly siege. Every sunset was a transition from a world where humans were capable, competent, and in control, to a world where they were blind, outnumbered, and desperately vulnerable to predators that could see perfectly in darkness. Predators that had evolved for millions of years to hunt in conditions where humans were essentially helpless. The prehistoric landscape shared with early humans was filled with creatures that would seem more at home in our nightmares than in reality. Cave lions, larger than any modern cat. Saber-toothed predators, engineered by evolution to hunt massive prey. Hyenas with bite force that could crush bone. These weren't distant threats, they were present dangers. Evidence from archaeological sites shows that humans and these predators competed for the same shelter spaces, sometimes even sharing the same caves. So when the sun set, something profound happened. The balance of power shifted completely. Every advantage humans possessed during daylight, their intelligence, their tool-making, their capacity for cooperation, became nearly useless. In darkness, against predators that could see perfectly and move silently, humans were outmatched, completely outmatched, and they knew it. What did this do to the human psyche? What happened to consciousness when it was regularly forced to confront absolute vulnerability, complete sensory deprivation, and the constant possibility of violent death? How did cultures evolve when half of every day was consumed by fear and vigilance? What kind of spirituality emerges from nightly confrontations with darkness and terror? These are the questions that will guide us through the night. So settle in. Get comfortable. We're traveling back to a time when the night held mysteries and terrors that we can scarcely imagine today. A time that shaped everything we would become. The darkness that came before. When the sun dipped below the horizon during the Middle Pleistocene period, roughly 400,000 years ago, the world didn't fade gradually like it does in temperate climates today. In tropical Africa, where early humans spent most of their existence, There was no long twilight period that allowed eyes to adjust slowly and comfortably. The transition was dramatic and almost brutal in its swiftness. The sun would be visible above the tree line, casting long shadows across the savanna, and then, within what seemed like mere minutes, it would vanish. And the darkness would rush in like an incoming tide. For early hominins like Homo erectus, populations that inhabited Africa somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, this transition marked perhaps the single most dangerous moment of the entire day. This wasn't poetic darkness. This wasn't the gentle fade of dusk that allows the modern mind to slowly adjust its sensory input. This was a descent into what we might call absolute blindness, a sudden, complete loss of humanity's primary sense. Let's sit with this reality for a moment, because understanding it is absolutely essential to everything that follows. You are standing in what we might call a proto-human camp. Maybe you're one of the Homo erectus populations. Your day has been spent foraging, hunting small game perhaps, gathering seeds and nuts, whatever edible plants your group's collective knowledge has identified as safe. You've moved through daylight hours with relative confidence. The sun above provides not just light, but security. You can see threats approaching, you can navigate, you can read the expressions of your group members, which means you can gauge social dynamics, potential danger, and opportunity. But now the light is failing. The warm ochres and deep greens that defined the landscape are becoming muted. They're becoming grey. And then they're becoming something beyond colour entirely, something your eyes simply cannot process. This is when the fear would begin, and this wouldn't be abstract fear. This would be visceral, deeply biological fear. Your evolutionary heritage had equipped you, all animals really, with sensory systems honed by millions of years of predation. Humans were never the apex predators of the Pleistocene landscape. We were, in many ways, prey. And prey animals have an acute biological awareness of vulnerability. As light fades, that vulnerability spikes dramatically. You cannot see the approaching lion. You cannot spot the hyena pack gathering at the edge of your camp. You cannot distinguish between the shadow that is a tree and the shadow that is a predator waiting in that darkness. The darkness of pre-fire human nights wasn't simply the absence of light. It was an active reversal of every advantage. Every major predator on the African continent possessed sensory equipment vastly superior to that of humans in darkness. The big cats could see in near total darkness, their eyes reflecting and amplifying what little light existed. Their hearing was acute enough to locate prey by sound alone. Their sense of smell could track a human across kilometers if the wind was right. Hyenas, perhaps even more dangerous than lions in certain contexts, possessed powerful jaws capable of crushing bone and pack coordination that was devastatingly effective. There were saber-toothed cats in some regions, massive bears in others. In the waters, crocodiles of enormous size. And here's the particularly brutal aspect. Humans are diurnal creatures. We see primarily during the day. Our color vision is exceptional. Our daytime acuity is extraordinary. But our night vision is nothing compared to most of the predators we shared the landscape with. Evolution had simply not equipped early humans with the sensory tools to thrive in darkness, yet we found ourselves in it every single night. Consider what this meant experientially. As the last light drained from the sky, you would feel not just a loss of vision, but a loss of agency, a loss of control. All the skills that made you human during the day, your intelligence, your ability to plan, your capacity to craft tools and coordinate with others, became nearly irrelevant after dark. An early human with the sharpest intelligence and the finest spear was essentially defenseless against a predator that could see in the dark, move silently, and strike with overwhelming force and speed. The archaeological record suggests that early human groups responded to this vulnerability by developing what we might call defensive nighttime protocols. They didn't venture far from shelter when darkness approached. They gravitated toward caves, rock overhangs, or natural enclosures, locations that provided multiple protective factors. These weren't comfortable spaces necessarily, they were functional. They reduced the number of directions from which a predator could approach. They provided high ground in many cases. They offered psychological comfort simply through the presence of stone walls and a sense of enclosure. Within these shelters, groups would huddle together. This wasn't social bonding in any modern sense. This was survival strategy. The collective warmth helped with temperature regulation, particularly important in regions with significant seasonal variation. The collective vigilance meant that if a predator did venture close, multiple sets of eyes and ears, metaphorically speaking, given the darkness, had a chance of detecting it. There's evidence in the fossil record that sleeping arrangements were deliberate and organized, with larger individuals positioned at the perimeter and vulnerable members, children, elderly, injured, positioned more centrally. And then they would wait. Night after night, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans would wait for the darkness to pass. The experience of this waiting, this passive endurance of darkness, shaped human consciousness in ways that scientists are only beginning to understand. The human mind is not well suited to extended periods of enforced inactivity in darkness. Sensory deprivation induces a particular kind of psychological stress. Without external stimuli, the mind turns inward. Attention becomes hyper-focused on internal sensations, the sound of your own breathing, the beating of your heart, the random neural firings that create phantom sounds and shadows at the edge of consciousness. This is where the vulnerability becomes not just physical, but psychological. The human brain, when deprived of external stimuli in conditions of fear and uncertainty, tends to generate explanations for ambiguous sensations. A sound in the darkness becomes not just a sound, but a potential threat. A shape in the shadows becomes not just a shadow, but a predator waiting to strike. Anthropologists and cognitive scientists have suggested that this prolonged nightly engagement with fear, darkness, and the generation of internal narratives may have been one of the crucial contexts in which human imagination was forged. But for now, it's enough to understand the simple fact: early humans lived in a state of nightly siege. Every sunset was a transition from a world where they were competent and aware to a world where they were blind, vulnerable, and profoundly dependent on their group's collective ability to remain alert and defensive. The sensory world, when sight fails. To truly understand life before reliable fire, we need to imagine what the sensory world felt like for these night watchers. And this requires us to do something genuinely difficult: strip away our modern reliance on vision and reimagine how humans related to their environment when sight became almost entirely useless. Sound becomes everything in darkness, not metaphorically, literally everything. In the absence of visual input, the brain upweights auditory information dramatically. A sound that you might barely register during the day becomes, in darkness, a critical piece of information demanding interpretation. Is that the wind moving through trees or the movement of a large predator? Is that a bird settling in for the night or something else? Is that the normal ambient sound of the forest at night or something anomalous, something worth responding to? Early humans would have developed extraordinary acuity in processing soundscapes. And this is important. It wasn't just learned skill. There may have been evolutionary selection for individuals with better hearing and better auditory processing. Archaeological evidence from burial sites suggests that hearing loss was perhaps less prevalent than we might expect in ancient populations, which is somewhat surprising given the generally higher prevalence of infections and trauma. This might suggest that hearing health was particularly valued, carefully guarded, and perhaps protected through cultural practices we no longer have access to. The soundscape of a pre-fire night would have been extraordinarily rich and complex. In Africa, the night chorus of insects, amphibians, and nocturnal birds would have been intense and almost overwhelming. When we listen to modern recordings from African reserves and forests, the sheer volume is striking. Thousands of individual creatures, each producing vocalizations for mating, territorial declaration, or predator deterrence, creating what we might call a dense wall of sound. For early humans, this wall of sound was both comforting and terrifying. It was comforting because the presence of the prey chorus usually meant that large predators had not recently moved through the area. Predator presence tends to silence the prey chorus, so acoustic silence would have been more alarming than acoustic abundance. But it was terrifying because it was constantly changing, constantly introducing new sounds that required interpretation. The mind would have needed to develop sophisticated frameworks for distinguishing between routine sounds and sounds that signaled danger. The wind would have been a critical part of the auditory landscape. Wind moving through vegetation, wind changing direction, wind altering the acoustics of sound transmission, all of these would have been monitored constantly. Wind could mask the approach of predators or transmit scent differently than expected, and smell would have been second only to hearing as a source of critical information. The human sense of smell is often dismissed in modern discussions of human evolution, but this dismissal reflects our contemporary reliance on vision rather than any actual limitation in our olfactory system. Early humans would have been able to smell rain approaching across a landscape. They would have detected predators by scent, and each major predator has a distinctive scent signature that would have provided crucial time to prepare or flee. They would have been able to track animals and identify plants by smell, and in darkness, these capabilities would have become hyper-developed through necessity. Touch would have been another critical sense. In the darkness of a shelter, humans would have relied on tactile information to understand their immediate surroundings. The texture of the ground beneath them, the presence of group members nearby, the temperature of the air, the humidity, all of this would have been processed through the skin, creating a detailed, if non-visual, map of the immediate environment. There's evidence that early humans developed increasingly sophisticated tools, partly through the sense of touch. The ability to feel subtle variations in stone, to sense the correct angle for a striking flake, to feel the balance of a spear, these were skills that would have served them in darkness as well as in daylight. Now let's talk about something rarely addressed in discussions of human evolution: the psychological impact of relying on senses other than sight for understanding the world. Modern humans, whose brains have developed in a world of relatively abundant artificial light, tend to experience non-visual senses as supplementary to vision. We see something, and then we listen to it, smell it, or touch it for confirmation. For early humans, in the hours of darkness, this hierarchy would have been entirely reversed. The primary information stream would have come from non-visual senses, with vision providing no information at all. This is a radically different way of engaging with reality. Psychologically, this likely fostered a different kind of spatial reasoning. Modern humans tend to think in visual maps. We visualize routes. We remember places primarily through visual landmarks. Early humans, spending half their lives in darkness, would have developed spatial reasoning based on acoustic and olfactory maps. The mind would have learned to construct three-dimensional models of space based on sounds, echoes, and smell. They would have known caves and shelters, not through visual memory, but through the echo patterns and specific scent signatures of different areas. They would have known trails not through visual landmarks, but through the sequence of sounds, smells, and tactile sensations encountered along the path. This is not mere speculation. We can observe this in contemporary humans who have been blind from birth. Their spatial cognition develops differently, but it is in no way inferior to sighted cognition. They develop elaborate mental maps based on non-visual information. They move through space with confidence and grace, using senses that sighted individuals have largely allowed to atrophy. Early humans, living in a world where darkness claimed fully half of their temporal existence, would have developed similar capabilities. They would have known darkness intimately, not as something strange or alien, but as simply another mode of engaging with reality. However, and this is crucial, this did not eliminate fear. Even animals perfectly adapted to darkness, and many predators are such animals, show evidence of caution, alertness, and what we might call fear responses when encountering novel threats. Early humans, despite developing sophisticated non-visual navigation and perception, would still have been acutely aware of their fundamental vulnerability in darkness. There's another aspect of the sensory world of pre-fire darkness that we should consider: taste. For early humans, taste was likely a more significant sense than it is for most modern humans. Plants that are safe to eat must be distinguished from those that are poisonous, and taste is one of the primary mechanisms for making this distinction. But more than that, taste is intimately connected to memory and emotion in human neurobiology. Flavors are among the most evocative of memories, capable of transporting us back to specific moments and places with surprising vividness. For early humans, settling in for a dark night, consuming what foods they had gathered or hunted during the day, tastes would have provided both sustenance and psychological comfort. The familiar taste of familiar foods would have anchored them to normalcy and safety in an otherwise threatening environment. And then there are internal sensations: proprioception, the sense of where your body is in space, and the various internal signals that your body constantly generates. In darkness, with limited external stimuli, these internal signals become more salient. You become acutely aware of your heartbeat, your breathing, the subtle tensions and releases in your muscles, the minor discomforts and pains that characterize any living body. For individuals living in chronic stress and living in constant threat from darkness and predators certainly qualifies as chronic stress, these internal sensations might become amplified. Minor discomforts become acute. The normal variations in heart rate become occasions for concern. The mind, seeking explanations for internal sensations, might interpret them as signs of threat. This internal attentiveness, born from the sensory deprivation of darkness, may have contributed to the development of human consciousness itself. The ability to attend to internal states, to recognize patterns in one's own mental processes, to distinguish between different types of thoughts and sensations. These are foundational capacities for human self-awareness. It's possible that the nightly enforced confrontation with darkness, silence, and internal sensations contributed significantly to the development of the human capacity for introspection and self-reflection that we now consider one of our species' defining characteristics. The predator landscape of the Pleistocene. To truly grasp the terror that darkness would have inspired in early humans, we need to understand the predator landscape they inhabited. The Africa of the Pleistocene, and much of the world beyond Africa, was a far more dangerous place than the contemporary world, populated with megafauna and apex predators that make modern wildlife seem almost quaint by comparison. The Pleistocene saw species of lions that were significantly larger than their modern descendants. A modern male lion can weigh around 400 pounds. The lions of the Pleistocene? Some individuals exceeded 500 pounds. A single Pleistocene lion was already a formidable threat. A group of them, which regularly hunted cooperatively, represented a danger that no human group could effectively resist through direct confrontation. A pride of these massive lions could coordinate attacks with sophistication and tactical intelligence developed over millions of years of evolution. In Eurasia, during periods when early human populations migrated into that region, they encountered cave lions that were even larger still. Some individuals may have exceeded 550 pounds. These were creatures that had evolved to hunt the massive megafauna of Ice Age Eurasia: woolly mammoths, cave bears, and giant elk. A human population suddenly appearing in cave lion territory would have represented a novel prey source, a vulnerability to be exploited. Hyenas were perhaps even more dangerous than lions in certain respects. The Pleistocene saw species of giant hyenas that significantly exceeded contemporary hyenas in size. But more importantly, hyenas have bite force that exceeds even that of lions. Their jaws are engineered to crush bone, and they have a remarkable capacity to consume bone entirely. A hyena pack visiting a human shelter at night would have represented a threat that could not be easily repelled. Modern hyenas have been documented attacking human settlements and successfully killing humans, sometimes without warning. Prehistoric giant hyenas would have been orders of magnitude more dangerous. Saber-toothed cats, species like Smilodon, persisted in parts of the world until surprisingly recently in geological time, coexisting with early human populations for thousands of years. These creatures, with their distinctive elongated canines, were apex predators of extraordinary power. Some individuals may have exceeded 400 pounds, and they were designed by evolution to hunt massive prey, creatures like ground sloths and horses and camels. When megafauna began declining toward the end of the Pleistocene, Smilodon populations suffered, but during periods when they coexisted with early humans, they represented a predatory threat of the absolute highest order. There were also bears. The cave bear of Europe, which coexisted with early human populations for thousands of years, was a massive creature, larger than any modern bear. These were primarily herbivorous, which might suggest they were less dangerous than carnivorous predators, but they were formidable in size and strength, and if disturbed or provoked, they were extremely dangerous. There's evidence in the archaeological record of cave bears and humans competing for shelter space. Both species favored similar cave systems, and conflict between them was likely, particularly in the darkness of night, when visibility was compromised and fear on both sides was running high. Crocodiles inhabited the rivers and water sources that early humans were forced to use for drinking and, presumably, fishing. The Pleistocene included species of giant crocodiles, enormous creatures that could be among the largest predators in their environments. A crocodile dragging a human into water at night with no possibility of visual aid to companions on shore represented a type of death that was particularly helpless and terrifying. Here's what's crucial to understand about these predators in the context of nighttime. Most of them were more dangerous at night than during the day. Lions, despite being generally considered diurnal, often hunt in the early morning and evening when light is failing. Their eye structure, like that of most cats, provides superior low-light vision. Hyenas are primarily nocturnal hunters. Cave bears, while potentially encountered at any time, would have been particularly dangerous when disturbed in darkness. A night encounter in a shared cave space would have been extraordinarily fraught. Crocodiles are predominantly nocturnal hunters. Saber-toothed cats, based on what we can infer from their skeletal structure and hunting patterns, appear to have been capable of hunting in low-light conditions. This is the crucial point. The darkness that descended each evening was not a neutral condition for early humans and the predators around them. It was a condition that dramatically shifted the balance of power in favor of the predators. Every single night as the sun set, a population of apex predators became more active, more capable, and more dangerous, while the human population became less capable and more vulnerable. The predator landscape also included creatures of smaller scale but significant danger. Venomous snakes, which are most active during certain times of night, represented a threat in darkness. A human settling down for the night might encounter a snake in that darkness with nearly no way to avoid or defend against it. Scorpions, spiders, and other arthropods with venom represented smaller but still significant threats. A person rolling over in darkness and accidentally crushing a scorpion against their body might receive a sting that, while often not lethal, would have been excruciatingly painful and potentially dangerous to overall survival. The psychological weight of coexisting with this predator landscape cannot be overstated. Early humans, despite their intelligence and ingenuity, were fundamentally outmatched in darkness by the dominant predators of their world. Their daytime tools, spears, stones, and coordinated hunting strategies became largely useless in the dark. Their intelligence could help them find shelters and organize defensive positions, but intelligence alone could not overcome the sensory and physical advantages that predators possessed. Over the course of human evolution, this predator pressure likely created strong selective pressure for particular human traits. Group cohesion and the ability to work collectively would have been strongly selected for. Individuals who could coordinate effectively with group members, who could maintain vigilance, and who could respond quickly to threats would have survived better than those who couldn't. Humans who were capable of long-term forward planning, gathering shelter materials during the day, preparing sleeping spaces in advance, would have fared better than those who couldn't. The ability to recognize and remember dangerous situations would have been valuable. The capacity to transmit knowledge about predators and risks to offspring would have created strong advantages. But perhaps most crucially for our story, the predator landscape created an intense, selective pressure for humans to develop ways to manage darkness itself. As we'll see, the discovery of fire didn't happen in isolation. It happened in the context of populations that were desperately seeking ways to cope with the terrors of night, to regain some measure of agency and safety as darkness fell each evening. Shelter, sleep, and the architecture of survival. Given the predator landscape and the vulnerability of darkness, how did early human populations actually survive night after night? The answer lies partly in shelter selection and design, an architectural response to the problem of nighttime vulnerability that reveals sophisticated understanding of survival principles. The archaeological record shows clear evidence that early humans, even populations with relatively limited toolkits, showed deliberate preferences for certain types of shelter locations. Caves and rock overhangs were strongly preferred. These locations provided multiple protective advantages. First, they reduced the number of directions from which a predator could approach. A cave with a single entrance is vastly more defensible than an open-air location. Second, caves provided protection from weather, which was no small matter during periods when climate was variable or during the ice ages. Third, caves provided psychological comfort through enclosure, a sense of containment that appears to have been important to human psychology since ancient times. But not all caves were equally desirable. The archaeological record shows that early humans in Europe showed strong preferences for caves with elevated entrances, caves located on cliff faces or on hillsides where the entrance was significantly above ground level. This was clearly a deliberate choice. An elevated entrance meant that predators could not charge up a slope into the shelter at speed. It meant that any attacking predator had to climb or jump to reach the entrance, which gave humans inside more warning time. It also meant that humans defending the shelter had the tactical advantage of high ground. The depth of the shelter mattered as well. Caves that were shallow, with the back wall clearly visible, were preferred over caves that extended deep into the earth. A shallow cave allowed early humans to maintain awareness of the entire space, even with the limited light available from fire, once it was available, and could be evacuated quickly if necessary. A deep cave presented the additional problem of potential dangerous animals inhabiting the deeper sections. Archaeological evidence suggests that bears in particular used deep caves as hibernation sites, and a human population sharing a cave with a hibernating population would have faced significant risks, particularly during times when bears might wake or become active. The positioning within the shelter was also deliberate and strategic. Skeletal remains and artifact distributions suggest that social groups organized themselves deliberately for the night. Larger individuals, often interpreted as adult males, position themselves toward the cave entrance. Vulnerable individuals, children, the elderly, the injured, were positioned more centrally and further back. This arrangement maximized the protection of vulnerable individuals while positioning the strongest members of the group where predators were most likely to make their entry. There's also evidence of deliberate hardening of shelter spaces. At some sites, archaeologists have found evidence of stone arrangements that might have constituted walls or barriers. These would have served multiple purposes. They would have created separate sleeping areas for different individuals or family units. They would have helped retain warmth by channeling body heat, and they would have created psychological boundaries between the group and the darkness beyond the shelter. Some sites show evidence of what might be interpreted as thorny plant material arranged around shelter entrances, a barrier that would hurt a predator's paw or snout, providing an additional deterrent. The specifics remain debated among scholars, but the logic of such defensive measures seems sound. The temporal organization of nights would have been crucial as well. The night, we should remember, lasted 10 to 14 hours or more, depending on latitude and season. This duration meant that simple sleep was not viable as a survival strategy. The human body, in the absence of artificial light, tends toward biphasic sleep patterns, 2 sleep periods separated by a wakeful interval, and we should expect early human groups to have developed deliberate strategies for organizing this extended nighttime period. Some individuals, likely the youngest and strongest, would have taken turns on what we might call watch duty. This was not necessarily formalized. There's no evidence of organized shifts or rotating schedules in the archaeological record, but the logic is compelling, and the evolutionary pressures would have strongly favored groups that maintained some level of constant vigilance. An individual or small group of individuals, roused from sleep or voluntarily remaining partially awake, maintaining watchfulness for signs of predator activity, would have been able to provide warning and potentially mount a coordinated response if threats materialized. This night watch function would have been extraordinarily demanding psychologically. Remaining awake and alert in darkness, listening to ambiguous sounds that might signal danger, fighting the natural desire to sleep, managing one's own fear. These would have taken a toll. Research from modern studies of sleep deprivation shows that extended periods of vigilance, particularly in threatening circumstances, create significant psychological and physical stress. Over a lifetime, the accumulated stress of regular night watch duty would have been substantial. The nocturnal soundscape would have presented a constant challenge to interpretation. A sound in the darkness could be a predator, or it could be wind, or it could be a smaller animal, or it could be a completely benign acoustic phenomenon. The watchers would have needed to develop sophisticated interpretive frameworks to distinguish between different types of sounds. They would have learned to recognize the acoustic signatures of different animals, the specific sound of a predator moving through underbrush as opposed to wind-driven rustling. They would have learned which sounds required action and which could be safely ignored. There would also have been practical challenges of the nighttime vigil. A person sitting in darkness for hours faces the accumulation of small physical discomforts. Muscles stiffen, the body generates discomfort signals that demand response. The mind becomes restless without external stimulation. The vigilant watcher would have needed strategies for coping with these challenges. It's quite possible that nighttime was when songs, stories, or other forms of vocal or cognitive engagement helped pass the time and maintain alertness. The sound of a human voice might also have served a deterrent function, the presence of vocal communication suggesting a group of alert humans who were not passively asleep and therefore not easy prey. There's also the question of how groups manage the psychological toll of the night watch. A person spending night after night in vigilant darkness, listening for threats that might never materialize but could kill at any moment, faces significant stress. We can imagine that various cultural practices might have emerged to help manage this stress, rituals or ceremonies that transformed the fear into something more manageable, stories or mythologies that made sense of the dangers in the darkness, music or other forms of sound-based communication that created a sense of collective security. It's important to note that we have very limited direct archaeological evidence for exactly how early humans organized their sleeping spaces and nighttime behaviors. The archaeological record is sparse and highly subject to interpretation. We're reconstructing these practices from scattered remnants, the positioning of bones in caves, the arrangement of artifacts, the presence or absence of certain materials. This reconstruction is always tentative and subject to revision as new evidence emerges, but the logic of survival is compelling. Groups that failed to develop effective nighttime defensive strategies would have suffered higher predation rates, higher child mortality rates, and overall worse survival prospects. Groups that developed effective strategies, identifying good shelter locations, organizing defensively, maintaining vigilance, would have survived better and passed their knowledge and behaviors to succeeding generations. The cognitive burden of darkness. Let's spend considerable time now on something that is rarely discussed in the context of human evolution, the cognitive and psychological burden imposed by living in a world of regular, extended darkness. Modern humans, living with reliable artificial lighting, have become largely dissociated from darkness. We experience darkness primarily as a sleep condition. We go into our darkened bedrooms, we lie down, and within a relatively short period, we fall asleep. Even when we don't fall asleep immediately, darkness functions primarily as a signal to the body that it's time to rest. We've largely lost the capacity to engage consciously with darkness as a continuous temporal experience stretching across hours. But for early humans, darkness was not simply a sleeping condition. It was an extended temporal period during which the body was not necessarily resting. The mind was not necessarily disengaged from awareness, and the threat environment was actively heightened. This created what we might call a chronic cognitive burden. To understand what this burden consisted of, let's think about the types of mental work that darkness would have required. First, there was the constant interpretive challenge of understanding ambiguous sensory input. Sounds in darkness, as we've discussed, require interpretation. Is this a threat or not? This determination cannot be made quickly in many cases. A sound might be a distant predator, or it might be wind, or it might be a small nocturnal animal. The mind, in the absence of certainty, tends toward assuming threat. Evolution has equipped most animals with a bias toward overestimating threat in conditions of uncertainty. If you misidentify a wind sound as a predator and prepare for an attack that doesn't come, you've wasted energy, but you're alive. If you misidentify a predator sound as wind and you're attacked, you're dead. So the bias toward overestimating threat makes evolutionary sense. But this bias comes at a significant cognitive cost. Repeatedly interpreting ambiguous signals as threats, repeatedly mobilizing the nervous system in preparation for attacks that don't materialize, repeatedly experiencing adrenaline spikes and the stress response that doesn't lead to action. This is exhausting. Over a lifetime of nightly darkness accumulated across thousands of nights, this represents a significant cumulative psychological strain. Then there was the burden of maintaining vigilance. Vigilance is cognitively demanding. It requires sustained attention, the ability to notice and distinguish between relevant and irrelevant stimuli, and the capacity to maintain that attentional state despite fatigue and the natural tendency of the mind to wander. Studies of modern humans in vigilance tasks show that performance degrades significantly over time, particularly in conditions of darkness or reduced sensory input. Early humans engaged in nighttime watch duties would have experienced similar degradation, requiring significant cognitive effort to maintain alertness despite these natural declines in performance. There was also the burden of managing fear itself. Fear is not just an abstract emotional state, it involves significant cognitive processing. The mind must generate scenarios. What might threaten me? What could be hiding in that darkness? What happened the last time I encountered a predator? What might happen if a predator attacks right now? This scenario generation is largely automatic. It's a basic function of human cognition that we engage in constantly when facing uncertainty. But in darkness, with prolonged exposure to threat conditions, this scenario generation would have intensified and persisted. The mind, seeking to prepare for threats, would have generated elaborate, detailed mental models of possible threats, possible responses, possible outcomes. This imaginative work, while potentially adaptive in some ways, is cognitively demanding and psychologically exhausting. There was also the burden of memory and learning in darkness. Early humans, living across multiple nights, would have accumulated knowledge about their specific shelter spaces, about the acoustic and olfactory signatures of their local environment, about the predictable patterns of nocturnal animal behavior. This knowledge would have needed to be encoded in memory and retrieved reliably. The mind would have needed to build detailed, accurate mental maps of the shelter and surrounding area based on non-visual sensory input. This is cognitively complex work. It requires sustained attention to sensory detail, active encoding of that information into memorable form, and repeated retrieval and updating as new information emerges. Modern humans with visual maps can verify their spatial understanding regularly with a glance. Early humans working in darkness would have had no such verification, forcing them to rely entirely on their internalized mental models. And then there's what we might call the problem of meaning-making. The human mind is fundamentally a pattern-seeking, meaning-making system. When confronted with ambiguous or unexpected phenomena, the mind automatically generates explanations. In a cave at night, hearing strange sounds, observing shadows that might or might not move, feeling drafts of air that seem to come from nowhere, the human mind would have been generating explanations for these phenomena. Not all of these explanations would have been purely rational. Some would have been more imaginative, more symbolic, more prone to what we might call supernatural interpretation. If a predator attack occurred, if a group member was wounded or killed by a large cat or hyena, the mind would have needed to process this traumatic event. And this processing would have inevitably led to questions about causality and meaning. Why did this person die? What could have prevented it? This event would have seemed almost inexplicably violent and terrifying, far beyond the normal range of human experience. Such events often trigger the generation of explanatory frameworks that go beyond the purely material. Perhaps the predator was not simply a predator, but something more, a spirit, a demon, a manifestation of divine will. Perhaps the death was not simply bad luck, but the result of some transgression or curse. This meaning-making process, the attempt to understand and integrate traumatic events into a coherent worldview, is a normal human cognitive function, and it may have been one of the contexts in which early human spirituality, mythology, and religion emerged. The unexplainable terrors of darkness, the unpredictable violence of predator attacks, the loss of loved ones to forces that seemed almost supernatural in their power. These experiences might have given birth to the first human attempts to make spiritual sense of the world. There was also the cognitive burden of collective maintenance, the work of maintaining group cohesion and social bonds despite the stress and fear of darkness. Human groups are complex social entities, and maintaining the cooperation necessary for collective defense requires constant social negotiation. Who will take the night watch? How will decisions be made? How will conflicts be resolved? What norms will govern behavior in the darkness? These social questions would have been constantly present, constantly requiring cognitive resources to navigate and maintain. And there was the issue of reproduction and sexuality in the context of darkness and danger. Human sexuality is not simply a biological function, it's deeply intertwined with emotion, attachment, and complex psychological processes. Engaging in sexual activity in a context of darkness, of shared shelter with multiple group members, of ever-present danger, these contexts would have required significant psychological and cognitive adaptation, mechanisms for privacy, for managing jealousy and sexual competition, for negotiating consent and desire. These would have been constantly developing and evolving. The cumulative cognitive burden of all this cannot be overstated. A modern human spending a day or two in complete darkness without external stimulation, in a threatening environment, aware of predator presence, that person would experience significant cognitive and psychological stress. Now imagine that this stress, in reduced form perhaps but persistent, was a regular feature of human existence, night after night, for a human lifetime, across tens of thousands of generations. The archaeological evidence from this period shows evidence of increasing brain size in early human lineages and increasing sophistication in tool-making and social organization. Scientists have long asked, what drove these increases in cognitive capacity? Multiple factors certainly contributed: the challenges of hunting large prey, the development of increasingly sophisticated stone tools, the management of increasingly complex social groups. But it seems plausible that the cognitive challenges posed by darkness and predator avoidance were also significant selective pressures. Humans with better capacities for sustained vigilance, for processing ambiguous sensory information, for maintaining psychological stability under stress, for generating creative solutions to survival challenges, these individuals would have survived better. Over many generations, these cognitive capacities would have accumulated and expanded in human populations. And this brings us to a particularly important point: the role of imagination and creativity in human response to darkness. Humans are not simply reactive creatures responding passively to their environment. When confronted with challenges, humans are capable of generating novel solutions, of imagining alternatives to the current situation, of planning for future possibilities. In the context of darkness and predator threat, this imaginative capacity would have been activated. Humans would have asked, how can we make darkness less threatening? What if we could create light? What if we could drive predators away? What if we could see in the darkness? These are creative, imaginative questions, and they suggest that the cognitive burden of darkness, while stressful and difficult, may also have been generative, may have, in other words, contributed to the development of human imagination, creativity, and the capacity for innovative problem-solving. The human capacity to ask, what if? And to imagine alternative possibilities might have emerged in part from the intense cognitive engagement with the problem of darkness and predator threat. The social and cultural dimensions of darkness. Living through extended darkness night after night necessarily shaped not just individual psychology, but collective culture. Groups that survived the nightly ordeal of darkness would have developed shared practices, shared understandings, and shared narratives to help manage the stress and threat. Let's think about the social structure that would have emerged around nighttime. In daylight, human groups are organized around various functional and social hierarchies. Certain individuals might be better hunters, better toolmakers, better strategists. social status, and influence flow from these abilities, but in darkness, some of these status differentials might have been disrupted or reorganized. An excellent hunter has limited advantage in darkness. A person known for their keen eyesight or rapid physical reflexes finds these abilities almost useless when vision is impossible. But a person with keen hearing, a calm demeanor, or the ability to remain mentally focused in stressful conditions, such a person might have found their status elevated during nighttime hours. This suggests that early human societies might have had different leadership structures or status hierarchies for nighttime versus daytime. During the day, the skilled hunter might lead. During the night, perhaps a different type of leader emerges, someone with the psychological and sensory capacities suited to darkness. This is speculation grounded in the logic of adaptive response to environmental demands, but it's worth considering. Societies that organize themselves around the best adapted individuals for the current conditions would function more effectively than those that maintain static status hierarchies regardless of environmental context. The role of women in nighttime defense is a particularly interesting question, one that is rarely raised in discussions of human evolution. Archaeological evidence suggests that women in early human societies were not passive individuals, dependent on male protection. There's evidence of tool-making by women, evidence of hunting participation, evidence of social status, and agency. In the context of nighttime, this agency would likely have been maintained or amplified. A woman with keen hearing, with calm judgment, with the ability to remain alert through a long night. Such a woman would have been valuable in the collective defense effort. The narrow spaces of caves and shelters, the hand-to-hand combat that might occur if a predator breached the shelter, these contexts do not inherently favor one sex over another. A woman could defend a shelter entrance or coordinate group response as effectively as a man. Nighttime would also have been a context for the development of particular ritual practices and ceremonies. Rituals serve multiple functions for human groups. They coordinate behavior, they generate a sense of collective unity, they provide psychological comfort through the predictability and structure they impose. It's plausible, even likely, that early human groups developed specific rituals associated with nighttime. Rituals for entering the shelter space, rituals for organizing the night watch, rituals for marking transitions between different sleep periods, rituals for waking up and transitioning back to the daytime world. These would have served both practical functions and emotional functions, helping manage the collective fear and stress of the extended darkness. Some of these rituals might have involved vocalization. Singing, chanting, or other forms of vocalizing might have served multiple purposes in the context of nighttime. They would have marked the presence of alert humans, potentially deterring predators. They might have helped the group maintain alertness and a sense of collective presence. They would have provided psychological comfort through the familiar sound of human voices. They might have served to organize and structure the experience of the long night, breaking it into segments and creating a sense of progress toward morning. There's also the question of storytelling in darkness. Darkness is the context in which storytelling naturally emerges. Without visual distractions, the human mind is more able to engage with narrative. A person sitting in darkness, listening to the human voice telling a story, is in a state of heightened attention and engagement. Storytelling would have served obvious practical functions, transmitting knowledge, teaching children about dangers, preserving collective memory. But it would also have served psychological functions, creating meaning out of chaos, processing collective experiences of fear and loss, generating a sense that the group's experience was coherent and understandable rather than arbitrary and meaningless. What kinds of stories would have circulated in these darkened shelters? Certainly stories about predators, how to recognize them, how to avoid them, what to do if encountered. stories about survival, about successful defenses, about the rare occasions when group members had somehow escaped predator attacks. Stories explaining the sounds of the night, the dangers of darkness, the reasons why darkness was a time of danger. Stories about stars and celestial objects visible in the clear night sky above the shelter. Stories about other groups, distant or legendary. Stories about the ancestors, about how the group had come to be in this place. These stories would have been crucial for transmitting practical knowledge from elders to younger members, but they would also have been crucial for psychological integration of trauma. Anthropologists have long recognized that human communities exposed to violence and danger often develop rich narrative traditions around those experiences, stories that make sense of the dangerous world, that explain causality and agency in a cosmos that often seems fundamentally random and unjust. In the context of darkness and predator threat, such narratives would have been especially important for psychological survival. There's also the question of how nighttime darkness would have shaped gender relations and sexual intimacy. The relative anonymity of darkness would have created different social dynamics around intimate relations. In a shelter, where multiple individuals are present, where the darkness obscures visual identification, different social rules might have applied. Alternatively, and equally likely, specific protocols and norms would have emerged to regulate behavior in darkness and to prevent the kinds of conflicts that might arise from ambiguity about intimate interactions. Consent itself becomes a different proposition in absolute darkness. How do you communicate desire? How do you ensure mutual agreement? How do you manage rejection or refusal? These practical questions around sexuality in darkness would likely have generated cultural solutions, specific practices or signals or understandings that allowed sexual negotiation in the absence of visual communication. Some of these might have been formalized into cultural practices or rituals. The nighttime shelter would also likely have been a context in which particular types of knowledge were transmitted from older to younger individuals. Knowledge about the local environment, about the specific predators in the region, about which plants were safe to eat and which were dangerous, about the best paths through dangerous territory. This knowledge transmission would have been partly verbal, but it would also have involved embodied learning. An older individual showing a younger person how to move quietly, how to sense danger, how to maintain emotional calm in threatening circumstances. These teachings would naturally occur in the darkness of the shelter, where the darkness itself was part of the learning context. Initiation rituals, if they existed in early human societies, and many contemporary traditional societies have them, might have had a nocturnal component. The transition to adulthood or to fuller participation in the group might have involved tests of one's capacity to manage fear in darkness, to maintain vigilance, handle oneself in a confrontation with danger. The initiate might be left alone in darkness for extended periods, left to manage fear and demonstrate readiness for adult responsibilities. This would have been a powerful and memorable experience, marking a transition from one social status to another. The material technology of darkness. Before we move to the dramatic transformation that fire would bring, let's consider the material technologies that early humans developed to help cope with darkness. These technologies were modest by modern standards, but they represented early human attempts to exert some control over the conditions of nighttime. The most obvious technology was that of shelter itself. We've discussed shelter location and organization, but the materials used to construct shelters also matter. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans modified natural cave and rock shelter spaces deliberately. They might have created barriers using stone, bone, or plant materials. They might have arranged sleeping areas deliberately, creating different levels or separated spaces. Some evidence suggests the use of hides or plant materials to create windbreaks or to organize space. These modifications were likely done during the daytime, with materials gathered and arranged to improve the shelter's functionality for nighttime use. There's also evidence from some archaeological sites of the use of hearth areas within shelters, specific locations designated for particular activities. Before reliable fire, these hearth areas might have served other purposes. They might have been locations for working on tools by day or for food preparation. The designation of a specific area for activities might have created a sense of organization and control over the shelter space, which would have had psychological benefits for a group facing long, dark nights. Clothing was another material technology relevant to nighttime. Humans are tropical creatures by origin, and in many of the regions where early human populations lived, temperatures did not drop dramatically at night. But during periods of glacial climate, or in the winter months of temperate regions, nighttime temperatures could drop dangerously low. Evidence suggests that by at least 100,000 years ago, early humans were using hides and furs to create clothing. Before this, or in warmer climates, clothing as protection from cold was less necessary. But early humans in cold regions would have needed strategies for maintaining body temperature through the night. Huddling together provided some insulation. Clothing would have provided additional insulation. The possession of adequate clothing for the night would have been important for survival in cold climates. There were also tools that served protective functions. Spears and clubs, while less effective in darkness than in daylight, could still serve a defensive purpose. A barrier of sharpened stakes driven into the ground around a shelter entrance would have made it more difficult for a predator to attack and would have provided psychological comfort to the people inside. There's some archaeological evidence for such barrier-like structures around early human shelter sites. Slings, which could be used to throw stones, required less light to use than some other weapons. A stone thrown in the general direction of a threatening sound might deter a predator, or at least signal that the humans inside were not passively defenseless. Tools for working with fire, once humans learned to make and control it, became crucial. But before that, the night had to be managed without fire. There were, however, materials that could create minimal light without being actual fire. Bioluminescent organisms exist in various forms. Certain fungi and insects produce their own light. Some caves have phosphorescent minerals that might provide very faint illumination. Archaeological evidence has not definitively demonstrated that early humans deliberately used these materials for light, but it's worth considering as a possibility. A handful of bioluminescent beetles in a container, or dried bioluminescent fungus, would have provided minimal light, but it would have been better than nothing. It would have been enough to provide psychological comfort, a faint glow in the darkness, even if it provided minimal practical illumination. More speculatively, humans might have used phosphorescent materials to create symbolic markers or signals. These would have been placed at cave entrances or in key locations to serve as markers of safety or at the boundaries of dangerous areas to warn against venturing into dark spaces at night. These would have been primarily psychological and cultural signals rather than practical illumination, but they would have served important functions nonetheless. There's also the question of sleep technology, tools or arrangements designed to improve sleep quality or comfort. Archaeological evidence from some sites suggests the deliberate arrangement of bedding materials. Leaves, grasses, hides, and other plant and animal materials were arranged into sleeping spaces that would have provided some insulation from the cold ground and some comfort for resting individuals. The quality of sleep would have directly affected the ability of the group to maintain vigilance and function effectively, so optimization of sleeping conditions would have been a significant concern. There's also evidence from some sites of the use of ochre, an iron oxide pigment that was ground and used for various purposes. Some of this ochre might have been used for body decoration or symbolic purposes, which could have had nighttime functions. Ochre might have been used to mark individuals, creating visual distinctions even in minimal light. It might have been used in ritual or ceremonial contexts associated with nighttime. The exact functions are speculative, but the widespread use of ochre in early human societies suggests it had important cultural functions that extended beyond simple practical utility. Toolmaking itself was relevant to nighttime management. The manufacture of stone tools requires good daylight or other bright conditions. It would not have been a nighttime activity, but the tools produced during the day, spears, blades, scrapers, would have been essential for processing food and maintaining the shelter in functional order. The organization of toolmaking would have been part of the daytime routine, with deliberate production of items that would be used for nighttime defense or other nighttime needs. There's also the question of timekeeping. Early humans would have needed to track the passage of night and anticipate when dawn would arrive. The primary marker, of course, was the position of the stars. In the hours before dawn, specific stars would appear or move toward the horizon, providing cues that dawn was approaching. But humans might also have used other methods. The position of the moon could be tracked. The patterns of nocturnal animals could serve as temporal markers. Certain animal calls occur at specific times of night, so the hearing of those calls could indicate how much of the night remained. Internal body rhythms would provide some sense of how much time had passed since sleep began. Tracking the passage of the night would have been important for morale. The knowledge that dawn was approaching, that the dangerous period was nearly over, would have provided psychological comfort. The worst period psychologically might have been in the depths of the night, when dawn seemed impossibly distant and the darkness seemed eternal. The earliest moments before dawn, when the sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly, might have been moments of profound relief and anticipation. There were also likely practices around waste management and sanitation that related specifically to nighttime. Using a toilet in darkness is inherently problematic. It requires leaving the shelter space, navigating in darkness, dealing with visibility and physical coordination problems. Early human groups would likely have developed designated toilet areas nearby, but outside the shelter, perhaps marked in some way to help navigation. They might have preferred to deal with toilet needs during the earliest stages of twilight, when some light was still available, rather than in the depths of darkness. This is speculative, but it's based on the logical problems posed by basic human biology in conditions of darkness. All of these material technologies and practices were responses to the fundamental problem of nighttime vulnerability. They were attempts to exert some control over conditions, to reduce vulnerability, to improve comfort and psychological stability through the long night. None of them could completely solve the problem, none of them could make the night safe or comfortable by modern standards, but collectively they represented human ingenuity applied to a fundamental survival challenge: disease, health, and the night. Let's turn now to a dimension of pre-fire existence that is rarely discussed: the health implications of spending extended periods in darkness and confined spaces with other people. The caves and rock shelters that early humans preferred for nighttime protection were valuable precisely because they provided enclosed, defensible spaces. But enclosed spaces create health challenges, particularly when occupied regularly by groups of humans. Indoor spaces without adequate ventilation accumulate moisture from human respiration and accumulate microorganisms that thrive in damp, enclosed environments. Before fire, there was no smoke problem from hearths, but there were other air quality issues. Enclosed spaces with multiple humans generate carbon dioxide and other gaseous byproducts of respiration. The human body also continuously sheds skin cells which become vectors for various microorganisms. Respiratory infections would likely have been common. The close proximity of multiple individuals in an enclosed space would have created ideal conditions for the transmission of viruses and bacteria. Children, with their more vulnerable immune systems, would have been particularly susceptible. Upper respiratory infections, pneumonia, and other lung diseases would have taken a regular toll. Given the absence of antibiotics or effective medical interventions, many of these infections would have progressed to serious illness or death. Parasitic infections would also have been prevalent. Internal parasites, transmitted through contaminated water or food, would have been endemic in early human populations. Intestinal parasites reduce nutritional absorption and create chronic inflammation. Regular exposure to parasites, starting in childhood, would have meant that most individuals carried some parasite load throughout their lives. This would have contributed to chronic illness, reduced physical capacity, and probably contributed to childhood mortality. Skin infections and mycotic infections, fungal infections, would have been common in the moist, enclosed environment of a shared shelter. Fungal infections thrive in darkness and moisture. Conditions like athlete's foot, candida infections, and more serious fungal infections would have been endemic in populations living in enclosed caves. These would have been uncomfortable and, in severe cases, could have been debilitating. The accumulation of waste materials in and around shelters would have created additional health hazards. Early human populations, before the development of sophisticated waste management systems, would have dealt with the biological necessities of the human body, defecation, urination, menstruation, in relatively basic ways. Designated toilet areas might have been maintained, but the complete isolation of waste from living spaces would not have been possible or even fully conceived. The regular exposure to fecal contamination would have created risk for intestinal infections and parasitic diseases. There's also the question of reproductive health in enclosed, potentially unsanitary shelters. Childbirth in such conditions would have been extraordinarily risky. Infection of the birth canal or uterus, infections that are now readily treated with antibiotics, would have been often fatal or at minimum serious and debilitating. Maternal mortality would have been high. Infant mortality would also have been high due to exposure to pathogens and inadequate nutrition. Menstruation would have been a particular health concern in enclosed spaces. Menstruating individuals without modern hygiene products would have dealt with blood in ways that both created personal hygiene challenges and potentially created contamination issues in shared spaces. The arrival of menarche, first menstruation, in adolescent females would have signaled fertility, but also created ongoing health management challenges every month. The particular diseases that affect enclosed populations would have been selected for. Tuberculosis, a disease that spreads readily in enclosed spaces and which causes chronic illness, even in individuals who don't die from acute infection, would likely have been prevalent. The chronic cough and malaise of tuberculosis would have been a regular feature of enclosed human populations. Histoplasmosis and other fungal diseases that are acquired from soil contamination would have been potential health threats, particularly in areas with specific soil conditions. There would also have been seasonal health variations. In colder climates and seasons, humans would have spent more time in enclosed shelters. This increased time indoors would have increased disease transmission risk. In warmer seasons, when more time was spent outdoors, disease transmission would have decreased. This seasonal variation would have created patterns of health and illness tied to the seasons. Physical injuries were another health concern in darkness. Moving around in a pitch-black shelter space, individuals would have suffered bruises, cuts, and potentially more serious injuries. A person stumbling in darkness and striking their head on stone could suffer concussions or skull fractures. A person stepping on something sharp or being struck by an object in darkness could suffer wounds. Without adequate medical care, many of these injuries would have become infected, leading to serious consequences. Eye health would also have been affected. Eyes that spend extended periods in darkness undergo physiological changes. The pupil dilates to try to capture available light. The retina becomes hypersensitive. When suddenly exposed to bright light, such as when exiting the shelter at dawn, eyes would have experienced pain and temporary vision loss. The repeated daily cycling from absolute darkness to bright sunlight would have stressed the visual system. Dental health would have been another concern. Dental disease, if it existed in early human populations, would have created chronic pain and potential serious infections if abscesses formed. The absence of dental care meant that dental problems, once they developed, would have persisted and worsened. The trauma of a tooth knocked loose in a fighting situation or struck during a nighttime stumble would have created pain and infection risk. Mental health implications of this disease burden also merit consideration. Living with chronic pain from parasites, living with the anxiety of knowing that illness and death were regular occurrences, living in perpetual uncertainty about whether one's children would survive to adulthood, these would have had significant psychological impacts. Depression and anxiety would likely have been common. The cognitive burden of chronic illness would have reduced the capacity for complex thought and planning. Yet, populations persisted and thrived despite these health challenges. Natural selection would have favored individuals with better immune systems, better resistance to parasitic infections, and better capacity to recover from illness. Over many generations, human populations adapted to the disease environment of enclosed shelters. Some of this adaptation might have involved cultural practices, specific arrangements of shelter spaces to improve air circulation, deliberate distance maintenance between toilet areas and living areas, specific practices around food handling and storage. Some of it involved biological adaptation, the evolution of immune systems better equipped to handle endemic diseases. Light and astronomy in the night sky. Despite the absence of artificial light, the night sky would not have been entirely dark. The stars would have been visible, and brilliantly visible at that. Modern humans living in light-polluted environments, where perhaps only a few hundred stars are visible at night, have largely lost the capacity to understand what a truly dark sky looks like. But to early human populations living far from any artificial light source, in a world where the sky had never been illuminated by electric light, the night sky would have been overwhelming in its brightness and complexity. On a clear night, away from any light pollution, thousands of stars are visible to the naked eye. The Milky Way, that great river of stars stretching across the sky, becomes a dominant visual feature, a luminous pathway of light that divides the sky into sections. Planets, particularly Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn, become bright points of light that stand out from the background of stars. The moon, in its various phases, provides significant illumination. A full moon can create enough light to read by, or certainly to navigate by. In polar regions, the auroras, those dancing curtains of colored light, would have been visible to populations living in high latitudes, creating spectacular and mysterious displays that would have seemed almost supernatural. The night sky would have been an object of intense attention and study. Without the distractions of artificial light, without the fatigue that comes from daytime activity, the human mind would have naturally focused on the stars during the long night hours. The patterns of stars would have been learned and memorized. Constellations would have been identified and named. The movements of the stars across the night sky, their rising and setting at different times throughout the year, would have been tracked and understood. Some of this attention to the stars was almost certainly practical. The position of stars could be used for navigation. The North Star, that reliable marker visible in the northern sky in the northern hemisphere, would have been known and used for orientation. The seasonal rising and setting of particular constellations could serve as markers of seasons, helping humans track time and anticipate seasonal changes in weather, animal migration, and plant fruiting. Knowledge of astronomy based on careful observation over many nights and many years would have provided valuable information for survival. But some of the attention to stars was likely more mystical or spiritual in nature. The fixed, eternal nature of the stars, their nightly appearance and disappearance, their apparent motion across the sky, their silent persistence year after year and lifetime after lifetime, these would have inspired wonder and speculation. Stories would have emerged explaining the stars, placing them in narrative frameworks that made sense of their apparent movements and their positions. The stars would have been invested with meaning, incorporated into mythology and spiritual understanding. The moon's cycle would have been particularly important. The moon's phases, its rising and setting, its apparent size, changes, all of these would have been regular, predictable phenomena, and yet the moon would have seemed almost alive in its changes. The emergence of a sliver of moon after the dark phase, its gradual waxing to fullness, its subsequent waning back to darkness, this cycle would have been observed countless times and would have provided a natural calendar by which to mark time. The lunar month, the approximately 29.5 days of the moon's cycle, would have emerged as a natural unit of time. Some evidence from contemporary traditional cultures and from the symbolic systems of ancient civilizations suggests that human awareness of the female menstrual cycle, which aligns closely with the lunar month, might have contributed to the spiritual significance of the moon in early human religions and mythologies. Particular celestial events would have been noted and remembered. Comets, those sudden bright objects appearing in the sky with their distinctive tails, would have appeared occasionally. These would have seemed unusual and remarkable, unexpected additions to the familiar star patterns. Meteors, those brief streaks of light caused by atmospheric burning of meteorites, would have been observed regularly. A meteor shower with dozens or hundreds of meteors streaking across the sky in a single night would have been a striking and memorable event. Solar eclipses, those moments when the moon passes directly in front of the sun, creating a sudden daytime darkness, would have been terrifying and meaningful events. A solar eclipse would have been interpreted not as a mechanical, astronomical phenomenon, but as a manifestation of cosmic significance, perhaps a sign of divine displeasure or cosmic danger. The ability to predict or at least anticipate these celestial events would have granted individuals knowledge that seemed almost superhuman. An elder who could predict that on a particular night the moon would disappear and reappear, or that the stars would shift their positions, would have been understood as possessing special knowledge or communion with cosmic forces. This knowledge, if preserved and passed down, would have accumulated over generations. Eventually, sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics could emerge from this accumulated observation. The brightness of the night sky, particularly on clear nights with a full moon or with an exceptionally bright star field, would have provided illumination for nighttime activities. The illumination from a full moon can be surprisingly bright. Shadows exist, the world takes on a silvery, ghostly quality, and vision is functional if different from daylight vision. During full moon nights, early humans might have engaged in nighttime activities that were impossible on dark nights. Hunting might be possible under full moonlight. Travel across unfamiliar territory might be feasible. Trading or social contact between groups might occur in the relative safety and visibility of full moonlight nights. This suggests that the lunar cycle would have structured human activity in ways we rarely consider today. There might be a rhythm to human activity linked to lunar phases. The dark phase of the moon, the period of 3 or 4 nights when no moon is visible, would be a period of maximum restriction, when nighttime activity is most limited and danger most intense. As the moon waxes toward fullness, gradually increasing illumination would allow increasing nighttime activity. The full moon would be a period of relative freedom and possibility. Then the cycle would begin again, with the waning moon providing decreasing illumination and the dark moon returning. This lunar rhythm would have been fundamental to human social and economic life. Important activities, hunts, ceremonies, gatherings with other groups, might have been scheduled for the full moon period. Dangerous activities, long-distance travel, exploration of new territory might have been reserved for full moon periods. The dark moon period might have been reserved for internal group activities, maintenance, tool-making, and other less risky pursuits. In this way, the rhythm of human culture would have been tuned to the rhythm of the moon itself. The significance of the moon in human spirituality and religion likely emerged partly from this practical basis. The moon's reliable cycle, its connection to human female fertility through the parallel with menstrual cycles, its provision of light in darkness, its apparent death and resurrection each month. These characteristics would have made it a natural object of spiritual significance. Many early human religions, based on what we can infer from surviving indigenous religions and from the archaeological record, placed the moon in a position of spiritual importance, equal to or sometimes greater than that of the sun. The darkness of the night sky, despite its brightness in absolute terms compared to our modern, light-polluted skies, would still have been fundamentally dark compared to daytime. The stars and moon provided minimal functional illumination for the survival activities that required light. The psychological and spiritual impact of the star-filled night sky would likely have been more significant than its practical utility. The vastness of the sky, the infinite-seeming multitude of stars, the apparent eternity of their cycles, these would have been contemplated by humans seeking to understand their place in the cosmos. The genesis of spirituality and magic. As we approach the middle of our journey through the pre-fire night, we should consider one of the most profound implications of living in extended darkness, the likely genesis of human spirituality, magic, and religion. The conditions of darkness, sensory deprivation, heightened threat, confrontation with one's own internal mental processes, are conditions that have consistently, across cultures and throughout history, been associated with spiritual and religious experiences. People undergoing vision quests, deliberately seeking spiritual insight, often do so in darkness or in conditions of sensory deprivation. Shamanic traditions across the world involve journeys in darkness or in closed spaces. Mystical traditions frequently describe the spiritual path as involving darkness before enlightenment. Buddhist meditation practices, Hindu yoga traditions, Islamic Sufi practices all have elements involving darkness, isolation, and internal focus. These patterns suggest that there is something about darkness and deprivation that opens the human mind to spiritual experience. For early humans living in regular, extended darkness, these conditions would have been constant. The mind, deprived of external sensory input, tends to generate internal phenomena. Hallucinations in the technical sense, perceptual experiences without external sensory input, are not rare in conditions of darkness and sensory deprivation. The boundary between imagination and perception, which is usually clearly marked in conditions of rich external sensory input, becomes blurred in darkness. A sound that might be identified as a tree branch in daylight becomes, in darkness, ambiguous. It could be a branch, or it could be a predator, or it could be a spirit. The human tendency toward pattern recognition, which is adaptive in normal conditions, can become hyperactive in darkness and fear. The mind seeks patterns in ambiguous data and generates explanations for unexplained phenomena. The wind in a cave becomes the breath of a creature. Shadows that might be stationary rocks become moving entities. The combination of genuine sensory signals from the environment, sounds, air movements, tactile sensations, and imagination becomes so intertwined that distinguishing them becomes difficult. This is not a failure of human cognition. It's actually a sophisticated response to ambiguous information. This is the fertile ground in which spirituality and magic might emerge. Early humans in these conditions might have experienced what were genuinely perceptual anomalies, experiences that seemed real and present even though they had no external referent. They might have seen things in the darkness that had no external source, visions generated by their own minds. They might have heard voices or music that came from no external source but seemed profoundly real. They might have felt presences in the darkness, sensed the attention of beings that were not physically present but seemed almost real in their psychological force. These experiences, far from being dismissed as hallucinations or imagination, would have been understood as genuine encounters with something real. But real in a different way than physical reality. The human mind is capable of recognizing that not all realities are physical. An idea, a feeling, a memory, these are real in meaningful ways, even though they're not physical objects. In the same way, the beings and presences encountered in darkness might have been understood as real in a spiritual or psychological sense, even if they weren't physically present. Out of these experiences, spirituality and religion would naturally emerge. A cosmology would develop to explain the beings encountered in darkness. These might be understood as spirits, demons, gods, or ancestors. Stories would be constructed to explain who these beings were, what they wanted, why they appeared in darkness. Rituals would be developed to interact with these beings, to appease them, to seek their favor, to protect oneself from their malevolence. Magic would emerge as a set of practices designed to influence the spiritual realm and thereby affect the physical world. The shamanic traditions that exist in many indigenous cultures might preserve echoes of these ancient practices. Shamanism typically involves the shaman entering an altered state of consciousness, achieved through various methods, including sensory deprivation, rhythmic music and movement, or hallucinogenic plants, in which they journey to a spiritual realm and interact with spiritual beings. The journey often occurs in conditions of darkness or with eyes closed. The shaman returns from this journey with knowledge or power that can be used to heal or to influence the community. This pattern, darkness, altered consciousness, encounter with spiritual beings, return with knowledge or power, might be a very ancient human practice, arising from the nightly confrontation with darkness and the internal experiences that darkness generated. Totemism, that spiritual complex in which individuals or groups are identified with particular animals or natural phenomena, might also have emerged from pre-fire darkness. An individual having a profound encounter with the image or presence of a predator in darkness, an image that might be partly sensory and partly imaginative, might interpret this as a spiritual connection or identification with that animal. Over time, this might become formalized as a totem, a spiritual representation of that individual or group's identity. Ancestor worship, common in many traditional societies, might also have emerged from conditions of darkness. The dead are absent physically but powerfully present in memory and imagination. In darkness, when sensory input from the present is minimal, attention naturally turns inward to memory. The faces and voices of the dead might become vividly present in imagination. The boundary between remembering and encountering might blur. The dead might come to seem present in the darkness, available for communication and consultation. This would have laid the foundation for practices of ancestor veneration and communication. Taboos and ritual prohibitions would likely have emerged from this spiritual worldview. Certain actions might be understood as offending the spiritual beings of darkness. Certain foods might be understood as having spiritual significance, not to be eaten at night, or eaten only in particular ritual contexts. Certain sounds or movements might be understood as dangerous because they attracted spiritual attention or angered spiritual beings. These taboos would have served practical functions, preventing unnecessary risk-taking, maintaining group cohesion, directing behavior in ways that were adaptive, while also serving spiritual purposes in the community's understanding of reality. The development of these spiritual and magical practices would have had significant psychological effects. The community that understands darkness as the realm of spirits that has rituals to manage spiritual threats, that understands their nightly vulnerability in terms of a coherent spiritual cosmology, such a community would have managed the psychological stress of darkness more effectively than a community without such frameworks. The fear would not be eliminated, but it would be channeled into understandable forms and managed through rituals that provided a sense of control and agency. This is not to say that spirituality and religion emerged solely from the experience of darkness. Many other factors contributed to the emergence of human religion. The confrontation with death and the mystery of what happens after death. The recognition of causality and the desire to understand how the world works. The aesthetic experiences of nature and the impulse to create beauty. The social functions that religion serves in binding groups together. All of these contributed to religion's emergence, but the regular, extended confrontation with darkness, sensory deprivation, threat, and the internal experiences these generated would have been a significant context in which spiritual and religious understanding developed. The physical artifacts that remain from archaeological sites of this period provide some hints. Ochre pigments used in mysterious ways, sometimes found in graves, small carved figurines of animals or abstract forms, arrangements of bones or stones that seem to have no practical purpose, caves with handprints created by blowing pigment around the hand, a gesture that seems primarily spiritual or symbolic, evidence of decorations in deep caves that seem to have no practical purpose. Why create elaborate art in the depths of a cave where it would rarely be seen? These artifacts suggest that early humans were creating objects for purposes that were at least partly spiritual or symbolic. The famous cave paintings of Europe, the lions and horses and handprints of sites like Chauvet Cave or Lascaux have been understood in various ways. Perhaps they were hunting magic designed to ensure successful hunts. Perhaps they were spiritual representations of the animals themselves. Perhaps they were simply artistic expression motivated by the human desire to create beauty. But importantly, many of these caves are in locations that required significant effort to access, traveled deep into darkness to paint images that few would ever see. This suggests motivations that were not primarily practical. These were likely spiritual or ritual locations, places where the sacred and the artistic intersected. The handprints, in particular, are striking. The hand is such a basic and immediate representation of the self. A handprint is, in a very real sense, the trace of an individual's presence. Creating a handprint in a dark cave, blowing pigment around the hand to leave its negative outline on stone, seems almost like a spell or incantation. A way of asserting one's presence against the darkness, a way of saying, I was here, I was real, I existed. This impulse to assert presence and reality against the void of darkness seems deeply human, deeply spiritual. The expectation of dawn. To truly understand the experience of pre-fire nighttime, we must consider one more crucial dimension: the constant, sometimes desperate anticipation of dawn. Every night would have brought with it the knowledge that dawn would eventually come. The night, however long and terrifying, was not permanent. The sun would return. This basic certainty that the day would eventually come would have been perhaps the most important psychological anchor for humans living through the extended darkness of the night. The anticipation of dawn would have built as the night progressed. In the earliest hours after sunset, when the night was still young and dawn seemed impossibly distant, the primary focus would have been on defending the shelter and managing immediate threats. But as the night progressed, and remember, this could be 10, 12, or 14 hours, the psychological tone would shift. The deepest part of the night, the time when dawn seems furthest away, would likely have been the most difficult time psychologically. This is often called the dark night of the soul in spiritual traditions, and there's likely a biological basis for why this time feels uniquely difficult. The human sleep cycle reaches its deepest point in the middle of the night, and the combination of sleep drive and psychological fatigue reaches its peak. But after this nadir, as the night progressed toward the latter part, the anticipation of dawn would have begun to intensify. The sky, still completely dark from a human perspective, would begin imperceptibly to shift. These shifts would have been detected through constant awareness. The temperature, often at its coldest in the hours before dawn, would begin almost imperceptibly to shift. The bird chorus, which falls silent during the height of night, would begin to stir as dawn approaches. Different birds have different dawn songs, and the sequence of these songs provides information about how far dawn actually is. The stars, for those watching the sky, would begin to shift position as the celestial sphere rotated toward bringing the sun back to the horizon. The anticipation would have created a rhythm to the night. Despair and fear in the early hours. Struggle to maintain vigilance in the depths of the night. Gradual shift toward hope and anticipation as the signs of coming dawn accumulated. The stress of the night would have had peaks and valleys, with the deepest valleys in the middle of the night and relative peaks during the early evening and the pre-dawn hours. This rhythm would have become internalized. The human body, even in the absence of external light cues, has circadian rhythms, internal biological clocks that drive various physiological processes. These circadian rhythms, entrained over thousands of generations to the pattern of day and night, would have created internal cycles of alertness, hormone secretion, and various other physiological processes. Even in darkness, the body would have known approximately where it was in the night cycle. This internal knowledge would have contributed to the rhythm of anticipation and the shifting psychological state across the night. In the hours approaching dawn, as the signs of morning approached, the temperature shift, the bird sounds, the position of the stars for those watching the sky, a profound shift would have occurred. The danger was nearly over. The return to daylight, to the safety and capability that daylight represented, was imminent. Relief would have been building. The vigilant watchers would have been looking toward the horizon, watching for the first signs of light. The sleeping members of the group would have been waking naturally, roused by the biological shift toward morning and by the increasing alertness of the group. The actual moment of dawn, when the first light appeared on the horizon, would have been profoundly significant. The return of light is not, biologically speaking, a sudden event. It's gradual. The sky lightens imperceptibly at first, then gradually, then relatively quickly. But psychologically, it would have felt like a profound transformation. The darkness that had seemed so permanent, so inescapable, was ending. The safe, capable day world was returning. The period of vulnerability and fear was concluding. The relief would have been palpable. The first moments of true daylight, when the sun broke above the horizon and the world transformed from near darkness to the familiar bright day world, would have been moments of profound gratitude and often joy. A group that had survived the night had made it through. They had endured. They would now have the day to forage, to hunt, to repair tools and shelters, to engage in social activities, to rest and recover from the stress of the night. Relationships between group members would have normalized. Children would play. The normal business of daily life would resume. This daily cycle, night of danger and vulnerability, day of relative safety and capability, repeated day after day, month after month, year after year, would have been the fundamental rhythm of human existence in this period. The anticipation of dawn would have been a constant feature of the night. The relief and gratitude at the arrival of dawn would have been equally constant. Over a lifetime, Across thousands of nights, this pattern of fear and relief would have shaped human consciousness and psychology in ways we are only beginning to understand. The arrival of reliable fire would transform this pattern fundamentally. With fire, the boundary between day and night would become less absolute. The night would no longer be an impassable barrier to activity. The predators would be deterred by flames. The darkness would recede, pushed back by the light of the fire. The danger would diminish dramatically. The constant nightly cycle of fear and relief would be broken. This transformation would be one of the most profound changes in human history. But that transformation was still far in the future for the people we have been considering. For now, night after night, they waited for dawn. They endured the darkness. They managed the fear. They sustained themselves and their group through the long, dark, dangerous hours until the sun returned to the sky. Closing reflection, the night before fire. As we prepare to close this long journey through the pre-fire night, let's take a moment to sit with the full weight of what we've explored, to fully grasp as much as modern humans can what it meant to live in a world where darkness was not merely the absence of light, but an active, overwhelming presence that shaped every aspect of existence. Imagine, if you will, that you are an early human living perhaps 100,000 years ago, somewhere in Africa or in the Middle East, or perhaps Europe if your ancestors had migrated that far north. You are living as part of a group of perhaps 20 to 50 people. You have sophisticated stone tools, you have language, you have culture, but you have not yet discovered fire, or rather, you have encountered fire. Lightning struck trees, natural fires burning across the landscape, but you have not yet learned to make it reliably or control it. Your day has been spent as days are always spent. You have searched for food. Perhaps you hunted, moving across the landscape with your group, tracking animals, waiting for opportunities. Perhaps you gathered, collecting seeds, nuts, roots, and edible plants. Perhaps you spent time maintaining tools, creating new stone implements, sharpening blades. Perhaps you engaged in social activities, resolving disputes, cementing bonds, teaching children the knowledge they need to survive. Perhaps you spent time in ceremonial or spiritual practices, rituals that mark seasons, rituals that connect the group with the spiritual dimensions of existence. But now the sun is setting. You feel the familiar dread beginning to build. The knowledge that darkness is approaching, that the night will come, that you will once again face the ordeal of extended hours in darkness, vulnerable, dependent on the collective vigilance of your group and the shelter provided by the cave or rock overhang where you have chosen to spend the night. You move toward the shelter as the light begins to fail. You and your group members carry what tools you've been working with, carry any foods you've gathered or hunted. You move somewhat quickly, not panicking, but aware of the urgency. Better to reach shelter before full darkness falls than to be traveling when vision becomes impossible. As you approach the shelter, you check the site. Is there any evidence that a predator has visited? Are there fresh markings? Any signs of danger? The shelter is a space you know intimately, but you check it anyway, because complacency is deadly. You see the familiar markers, the arrangement of stones, the specific acoustic properties of the space, the particular smell of the rock, and the accumulated presence of your group. You settle into your assigned area, your sleeping place where you have slept many nights. The arrangement of materials, hides, plant fibers that create a somewhat more comfortable surface than bare stone. Around you, the other members of your group settle into their places. You can hear them, smell them, sense their presence, even in the advancing darkness. The sun disappears below the horizon. The colors drain from the world. the familiar daylight landscape becomes unrecognizable. You are now in your nighttime world, the world of darkness, of vulnerability, of waiting. Someone, probably one of the younger, strongest members of the group, begins the night watch. This person will remain alert through much of the night, listening for sounds that might indicate danger. Others will take shifts as the night progresses. You are not responsible for the earliest part of the night watch, so you allow yourself to begin to rest, though rest is a generous word for the fragmented, interrupted sleep of the pre-fire night. You close your eyes, even though it makes no difference. Closed eyes in total darkness are no different from open eyes. You close them anyway. It's a gesture towards sleep, a signal to your body that rest is appropriate. You lie still, trying to achieve comfort on stone, protected by hides and your own body heat and the collective warmth of the group. But sleep does not come easily. Your mind is alert despite your body's fatigue. You listen to the sounds of the night, the wind outside the shelter, the breathing of group members around you, the distant sounds of nocturnal animals, your own heartbeat seeming loud in the darkness. And you wait. Thoughts come unbidden. Worries about food stores. Will there be enough? Concerns about the elderly member of the group who has been sick. Will they survive the winter? Memories of the encounter with a predator 3 nights ago. You managed to drive it away, but the fear lingers. Anticipation of the ceremony that will occur at the next full moon. Attraction to a member of the group and the complex social dynamics that creates. Spiritual concerns and spiritual hopes. Dreams, both literally dreams, as sleep begins to come, and imaginative daydreams as your mind wanders in the darkness. You drift into sleep, but it's shallow sleep. You wake after what feels like a short time, though you cannot know how long has actually passed. Was it an hour? 2 hours? You cannot tell. The night seems to have barely begun, and yet you feel as though you've been lying here forever. You lie awake for a while. Around you, others also wake. Someone gets up to relieve themselves, moving carefully through the darkness toward the designated toilet area near the shelter entrance. You hear their careful footsteps, hear them return. On the other side of the shelter, you hear quiet movement, perhaps another person waking, or perhaps just the shifting of someone already awake. The night watchkeeper makes a small sound, a quiet vocalization that means all is well. No danger detected. The sounds of the night are normal. The predators have not come close. There is no immediate threat. This brings a small measure of comfort. You might sleep again, and so you do, drifting in and out of sleep through the long night. Dreams come, strange visions generated by your sleeping mind, sometimes coherent, sometimes fragmentary. Perhaps you dream of the day's hunt, playing out scenarios of what might have happened. Perhaps you dream of spirits or ancestors. Perhaps you dream of abstract images and sensations that have no clear meaning but that feel profoundly significant in the moment. The night progresses. You become aware, over hours, that dawn is approaching. Perhaps consciously through the accumulation of signs, sounds of birds beginning to stir, the sense that the temperature has begun to shift, or perhaps simply through the internal biological knowledge that dawn is near. The anticipation begins to build. The fear and vulnerability of the night begin to give way to hope and anticipation. And then finally, impossibly, the first light appears on the horizon. You don't see it directly. The shelter entrance is positioned in a way that doesn't face directly east, but you sense it. The world is becoming less dark. The boundary of night is receding. Soon, very soon, the sun will rise and the day world will return. The group begins to stir. People wake, the night watch person can finally rest. The group members rise from their sleeping places and begin the transition to daytime activity. Someone steps outside, looks at the rising sun, and perhaps offers a quiet gratitude or acknowledgement. The sun is returning. The night has ended. Another day is beginning. This is the rhythm of existence that has defined human life for hundreds of thousands of years. Night after night, this cycle repeats. Generation after generation, humans endure this nightly ordeal. They develop culture and spirituality and art and complex social structures, all emerging from and shaped by this fundamental reality. The confrontation with darkness and vulnerability every single night, year after year, lifetime after lifetime. This is what it meant to be human before fire. To be the night watchers, the creatures who lived in constant tension with the darkness, who faced it and endured it and developed the psychological, social and spiritual capacities to survive it. This experience shaped us in ways we continue to carry today, even in our brightly lit world where darkness has become almost a novelty, a rare exception. The fear of darkness that many humans still carry, the comfort we find in the presence of others, the creative and spiritual dimensions of human consciousness, these all have roots in this ancient experience. We are, all of us, the descendants of the night watchers. We carry their legacy in our bodies, our minds, and our cultures. Understanding their experience, imagining what it was like to live in that ancient darkness, helps us understand ourselves and the long journey that brought us to this modern world, where darkness is something we can switch off at will. Closing sequence. As we reach the end of our exploration tonight, I want to return you gently from that ancient darkness to the present moment. You've spent the last couple of hours in the pre-fire night, imagining what life was like for humans when darkness was not a neutral absence of light, but an active, overwhelming presence. You've considered the predators that shared the landscape, the shelters that provided protection, the sensory world that was almost entirely non-visual, the psychological and spiritual dimensions of living in extended darkness. These early humans, our ancestors, faced challenges that we can hardly comprehend from our modern perspective. Yet they survived, they thrived, they developed culture, art, spirituality, and increasingly sophisticated technologies. They passed their knowledge and their genes to succeeding generations. And over time, their descendants discovered fire, a discovery that would transform human existence fundamentally. But that is a story for another night, another long darkness filled with the wonder of human achievement. For now, I hope you carry with you some sense of gratitude for the journey of human history, some appreciation for the challenges our ancestors faced and overcame. I hope this exploration has provided both rest and fascination as you lie comfortably in your safe, well-lit world, secure in the knowledge that you will never have to face the darkness as they did. Think about this for a moment. You are living in an extraordinary moment in human history. For the first time in this vast expanse of our species' existence, humans live with the ability to eliminate darkness entirely. We take this for granted, but this is genuinely revolutionary. Your ancestors waited through millions of nights for dawn. You can turn on a light. That single difference changes everything about what it means to be human in the modern world. If you've enjoyed this journey through the pre-fire night, I'd genuinely love for you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you these immersive historical explorations, journeys into times and places that shaped who we are. In the comments below, I'd be delighted to hear where you're watching from and what time it is for you as you listen. It's always fascinating to know that people from around the world are joining us in these nocturnal contemplations of human history. Perhaps you're watching late at night, when the darkness outside your window reminds you of the darkness we've explored. Perhaps you're listening during the day and imagining what those ancient nights must have been like. Either way, your presence here, engaging with this history, is a way of honoring the Night Watchers, those ancient humans who faced the darkness and survived, whose legacy runs through your veins. May your own night be restful and peaceful. May you sleep well knowing that you are separated from that ancient darkness by hundreds of thousands of years of human ingenuity and progress. May you wake tomorrow refreshed and grateful for the modern world we inhabit, a world built on the foundations of human courage and creativity, forged in the darkness of pre-fire nights. This is Whispers of Time. Thank you for joining me tonight. Until next time, sleep well, and remember we are all the descendants of the Night Watchers.